The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for our first webinar in the webinar series, We Believe Experiences Matter. I'm Pamela Stopford-Gay, Senior Marketing Manager at UserCentric, and I will be moderating the presentation. Today, Rick Omanson, Director at UserCentric, will be discussing heavily used interfaces, designing for efficiency. Rick has both an academic and industry background. He has over 25 years of experience in the industry, where he held technical and management positions at AT&T Bell Labs, Ameritech, and Infogix. Over 5 years of experience in consulting with IXL, now Razorfish, and UserCentric, and 5 years of experience as a research fellow at University of Pittsburgh. He holds several patents and has written a number of journal articles, book chapters, and conference papers on a variety of topics, including human factors, instruction, artificial intelligence, and cognitive psychology. In addition to being a director at UserCentric, Rick is an adjunct faculty member of DePaul University, where he teaches a course on human-computer interaction. Before I hand this over to Rick, if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the GoToWebinar dashboard to send in your questions, and I'll compile them for the Q&A at the end of the presentation. I'll also be monitoring the chat window, so if there's any technical issues, we'll try to address those as best we can. All right, let me take a minute and hand it over to Rick.
Hello. So today we want to talk about heavily used interfaces. A lot of the interfaces that we're used to, back up here a little bit, are interfaces that we use only occasionally. So a lot of the websites that we use for shopping, for instance, we may only go to once or twice a month. Or if we go to an information site like a museum because we're going to go visit it, we may only go there once or twice a year. There's kiosks that you walk up and use just because they're in the shopping mall, or if you're at a conference, you might download an app just for that particular conference. So in all these cases, the interface needs to work well. The very first time you use it, it has to be transparent, and it doesn't really matter if it's very efficient because you're not going to use it very often. But there are a number of other interfaces that are used a lot. So a lot of industries have back office operations where large numbers of people are doing the same type of activity all day long. In some cases it's ordering, in some cases it's managing different types of accounts. In health services, electronic health records are becoming more popular. And these are types of systems that doctors and nurses use all day long repeatedly. When you call in to place an order or get assistance for your software or some product, you'll typically call a call center, and these people are on the phones and their computers all day long using the same program over and over again. And probably the most interesting example is gaming, because here people use the same interface repeatedly, not because they have to for their job, but because it's enjoyable and they want to. And so there's some lessons to learn in particular by looking at gaming interfaces. So what I want to do today is to look at what the effects are of repeatedly using an interface. And I want to start by looking at how do users change when they use the same interface over and over again. Then we want to look at how does that repeated use determine what aspect of usability is important. So in some sense, how does the repeated use affect what's relevant in terms of usability? And then we'll look at a couple aspects about how repeated use affects design. So how do you design something to become efficient? And then we'll touch upon how to you design something to promote skill development, which is going to be an important part of the satisfaction in particular of using an interface repeatedly. So first, how does repeated use affect users? Let's start with a hypothetical example. So pretend that you work for a user experience consulting company, and a client comes to you and they say, we have an old system, it's a mainframe system, and we're going to upgrade it, and as part of that upgrade, we're going to upgrade the user interface. Now this user interface is used all day long by everyone, and so as part of this improvement process, we want to be sure that the new interface helps people be more productive. So we want to improve performance. You say, okay, what does your current interface look like? Well, it's this. It's an ordering system, and those of you who've been around a while will recognize that this is tied to a mainframe. In this case, it's a AS400. It's a type of screen that doesn't have a mouse. So you'd look at the client, you say, well, I'm very sorry. We can't help you. There is nothing that we can do that will improve performance, because in terms of performance, this is about the best there is. And we can make it prettier. We can certainly make it easier to learn, but there's very little that we can do to make it faster. And why is this the best there is? Well, one reason is, why is it efficient? It's efficient because everything's on the page. You don't have to go elsewhere. It uses a lot of direct entry instead of menus and mouse movements, which is a lot faster. But what's a little more interesting is, for the people that use this, why isn't it confusing? Because you look at the screen and it looks just chaotic. But people that use these types of screens day in and day out, it's not at all chaotic to them. So why is that the case? And I think that that's what the interesting question is. And it comes down to practice effects. So a practice effect is a phenomenon that we've known about forever. It's a notion of initial performance is slow, difficult, effortful, and then as behavior is repeated, performance improves. And that improvement's called a learning curve. So you can express this in a number of ways, and this one shows that the more that you use an interface, your performance goes up. You can also express it that the more you use an interface, the errors go down, or the time to perform a task goes down. It's all the same. It's different aspects of the same phenomenon. That the more you use an interface, the better you get at it. So if you're going to develop an interface that promotes it, what are the important things to support here? So we know that practice results in a faster, more accurate performance. But if you're going to design something that promotes and maximizes that performance, not necessarily learning, then you've got to go a little bit deeper as to understanding why are the performance, why is it faster? What's behind it? So what we're asking here is, how do users change as they repeatedly use this interface and make their performance better? So I want to point out, there's a number of things that happen, of course. So we'll look at three effects. One is that with repeated use, users remember instead of look. They remember patterns instead of features. And they automate responses. So remember instead of look. So what do you mean by this? consider the first time that you go to a program that's got a menu system and you want to perform an action. Let's say that you want to split your document into multiple files. So what you do is that you end up looking, scanning across the menu for the right menu, and then once you find what you think is the right menu, you scan down and look for the action that you want to perform. So menus, when you first encounter them, you scan them one at a time. And so this looking process is relatively slow, but more important, it's linear. So it takes twice as long to look through 10 items as it does 5 items. But if you keep coming back to the same menu, you pretty soon stop looking because you've memorized where things are at. And memory is a lot faster process. It's a logarithmic process that conforms to what's called the Heck-Hyman law. So even though it takes more time to recall something from 10 items than it does 5, it doesn't take twice as long. It's a lot faster type of process. And the fact that it corresponds to a logarithmic law that you can describe, you can actually model what the effects of repeatedly looking at a menu has on performance. So Cockburn and his associates, one of the things that they did was they constructed a model that assumes when you first come to a page, you always look, you always scan and look for what you are looking for. And then with practice, you start to stop scanning and begin to, in some cases, recall and go directly to the item to the point where you're just relying entirely on recall. And so the models that they constructed, these lines represent different types of menus, and these dashes are blocks of trials. So there's actually quite a few trials, quite a few hundred. The predicted results show these types of curves, which match pretty well to what the actual results were. And so it's evidence that what's going on here is that instead of looking, people are remembering and recalling where things are at. So how that affects the complexity is that the fact that it's dense doesn't really matter once you've memorized it, because you're not looking through here for the fax number order. You know that it's right there. And so when you come to the screen and that's what you want to do, you rely on your memory and you know right where to look and right where to act, and the fact that everything else is dense really doesn't matter. A second effect is that people see and remember patterns instead of features. So if you look at how a person who's very familiar with an interface, in this case it's a game, the game of chess, chess experts, when they look at a chessboard full of pieces, like this one here, they literally look at it differently than a person who is looking at it who doesn't know that much about the game. And the reason they look differently at it, research coming out of Carnegie Mellon by Bill Chase and Herb Simon, is that experts don't look at individual pieces. So here's an experiment that they gave an expert and a novice chess player, and in one case it was to look at the board of chess pieces, and while they were looking at it, just reproduce it over here. And then another case, they looked at it for 5 seconds and then reproduced it from memory. And of course, the chess players did better than the novice players. That's not too surprising. But then in interviews, when they were describing, what they were doing, what was interesting is that the novice people were, they had like 23 pieces, and they would say, okay, this piece goes here, and this one goes over here, and literally one piece at a time, we're trying to reproduce the pattern. what the expert chess players, they didn't see pieces. They saw strategies. This is such and such a well-known type of offense, and so this cluster of pieces actually represented a type of offense. And so what they were remembering were not individual pieces, but strategies, and then they could reproduce that strategy from memory very easily. So they were chunking the array into meaningful pieces. Now, if you start looking at things in meaningful chunks, it also improves what you can keep in mind. So the digit span test, again, it's been around forever, is a common way that people assess how much you can keep in mind at a time. And if you've never experienced a digit span test, it's worth going through the exercise. So what I want you to do is I'm going to say a few numbers, and after I'm done saying the numbers, just where you're at, just say them, repeat them back. Okay? 4, 7, 6, 6, 5, 1. I repeat it. Now let's try the second one. 4, 7, 8, 8, 9, 3, 4, 7, 6, 1, 0, 2. Now most people will find the second one slightly harder. And the reason is that, you know, the limit of how many arbitrary things you can keep in mind is roughly 7 or 4, depending on the circumstance and the research that you read. Bill Chase at Carnegie Mellon, however, worked with a long-distance runner, and after several months of intense training, was able to get this one individual's digit span from 8 to 80. So this person could listen to 80 numbers said out loud, just like I did, and then afterwards repeat them all back perfectly. And the way that this person did it was he would encode the numbers as running times. And so he would hear 2, 3, 5, 7, 4, 7, 9 as 2 hours, 35 minutes, 47.9 seconds. And since he was a runner, that meant something to him. He could picture what he would feel like if he was running a 5-mile run with that time. And so he was able to associate feelings and circumstance to this otherwise arbitrary string of numbers. And because it was a meaningful chunk, he had far fewer things to remember and could, again, just remember the large chunks, the large events, and then unpack them. So again, if you, the point here is that if things are meaningful, that you are able to keep more of them in mind, especially if you are chunking them together into larger groups. So for here, a person looks at this screen and they're not seeing individual letters and numbers and fields. They're seeing an order that's in a certain type of progress, and they understand the things that have led up to this and what's going to come afterwards, and it's a snapshot of a very meaningful pattern. And to remember what MDF means is not difficult, because for them it's not 3 individual letters. It is a single entity that has a lot of meaning and a lot of richness to retrieve what that means. And so as you become really familiar with what's underneath these, memory is not nearly the limitation that it is for a novice user who's coming up and seeing this for the first time. And finally, I want to talk about automating responses. So experts or practice users respond automatically. So repetition enables people to automate very common sequences. So if you do something over and over again, you can begin to do that automatically without thinking. Automated responses are fast, and that's good. Automated responses, however, are hard to change. And they are, once they're automated, they're actually very difficult to adjust. So there are a lot of situations where an expert can do worse than a novice if the situation changes from what they're used to. So French and Sternberg looked at expert bridge players, and when they changed the rules slightly, in this case it was instead of the turns going clockwise, they went counterclockwise, they did much worse than novices because all of their strategies that they just automatically did were hard to change when that assumption was disrupted. It's the notion of not being able to change an automated response. It's very powerful. And again, it's something that we've known about for quite a while. Stroop in the 30s had a really dramatic demonstration of this. So again, if you've not seen this, it's worth going to. What I want you to do is I'm going to show you some words, and your job is to say out loud the color, the color of the font, not the word itself. Okay? So just start from right to left, and don't say the word, just say the color of the font. Now, if you tried that a few times, this is not really hard because the color and the word coincide. On the other hand, try the same thing. Color of the font, not the word. Now, what you find is it's a lot harder. And the reason it's harder is because we read a lot, and that's a highly automated response. Even though reading was very effortful when you were in the first grade, you can't see a word and not read it. And so here what you're having to do is to try to inhibit that automatic response of reading the word, which is very difficult. So one of the things to keep in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, is that as people repeatedly use an interface, there are a lot of sequences that get automated, and those automated responses are both faster, but they're also less adaptive to change. So, given some of the ways that users change as they use an interface, if you talk about, well, what is a usable interface for a person for an interface that's used a lot? If we go back to how the International Standards Organization defines usability as the extent to which an interface can be used with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. This is a useful sort of breakdown of three important aspects of usability. And so by effectiveness, what we mean is, can the users complete a task, which is more of a focus on errors. Efficiency, can they do it in the way that they want to, and usually that means by, can they do it fast? And satisfaction is more of a derivative type of measure of how do you feel afterwards. Do you feel frustrated, neutral, proud from having used the interface? But I want to focus on effectiveness and efficiency And if you look at a learning curve, when you're first learning an interface, the important aspect of usability is, can you actually use it without errors? Are you able to learn it? Can you walk up and use it without making a mistake? And that is typically the focus of usability testing, of how many errors or what the mistakes are. Do you get lost? Are you confused? But after you've used an interface for 2 or 3 weeks, 8 hours a day, errors are not an issue, at least not in terms of interface errors. What now differentiates a good and bad interface is, does it slow you down? Does it force you to do steps that you don't want to do? Does it prevent you from working how you want to work? So it's now, after you've learned it, the important dimension of usability is efficiency. And then we'll touch a little bit later on satisfaction. So if I want to design an interface to be more efficient, what are some of the things to keep in mind? What are some of the principles that have shown to be effective? So I just want to list through 3 or 4 suggestions that we have found in our practice to make interfaces more efficient. And the first principle is to make information that you need for a decision visible. So, for instance, if you're designing a dashboard, what you want to do is to try to get enough information on the dashboard that you don't have to click deeper to get more information. You want to make your dashboards as complete as possible so that you can actually answer questions or do tasks from the dashboard itself. If you have a table where you need to make a selection, you want to have enough information in the table that everything that's there to make a decision is presented, so that the experienced user knows which item to click on, to edit, or to act on. Or if you're doing a form, especially if you've got a complicated form that needs additional information, you'll improve performance if you can actually present information that you need to make the decision. So rather than just having your form be a bare naked form and then rely on either knowledge or navigation to bring in other information, present the information right in the form that you're going to need in order to fill it out. Use dense screens. So one of the reasons that ordering screen was fast is that everything was right in the screen. So, of course, that works only if the location of the fields is constant. In other words, if there's something constant there that you can memorize. Density itself is not necessarily helpful. So, for instance, if you're looking at a news portal who has a different organization every day, the more dense that information is, the slower it is, because now there's nothing to memorize. You're back to scanning each time. So density is good as long as there's something constant that can be repeated that you can actually memorize. You want to keep controls close together. So Fick's law, which is back in the 50s, a well-known description of how long it takes to move a mouse, demonstrated that it is both the distance that affects how long something takes to move a mouse, as well as the size. Because the smaller an odd target is, then you have to slow down to be more precise. So because of that, you want to try to get your controls that you're going to click on as close as possible. So in a form, there's a place to, there's advantage of putting the button actually in the form itself so you don't have so far to move to. To use right-click menus, because there you're on the object itself, you don't have to move to a control to get to it. Keyboard shortcuts are a good way of, without moving elsewhere, you can perform an action. And then you want to keep your targets large. So here, where I've got a check on these little radio buttons, you not only want to make the radio button or the checkbox hot, you want to make the entire label hot. So if I click clear over here in horses, it still selects it. You want to maximize the size of the target whenever you can. So that, because if it's, the bigger it is, the faster it is. You want to rely on knowledge in the head. So this is a term popularized by Don Norman in Psychology of Everyday Things. He was contrasting how much, when you use an interface, are you doing it from memory as opposed to relying on information that's in the interface, or what he called information in the world directly. And if you rely on information in the head, it's faster. Because recall is typically faster than moving a mouse or using a menu. So where possible, use direct entry and text boxes, or at least have that option. For instance, in selecting dates, nice work by Tom Tellis at Fidelity looked at the difference between using drop-downs and to enter a date in a field versus direct entry. Drop-downs are more accurate, but direct entry is much faster. And so, you know, there's a trade-off there. But just in terms of speed, direct entry into text fields is by far faster. Using keyboard shortcuts, which now, depending on your interface, may or may not be able to remind a user what those are. Using icons without labels, where you can cram a lot more in, give more functionality if you don't have to label them, and if it's something that's used a lot, you can get by with that. You want to design for scanning. You want to keep the layout constant to promote memorization, and you want to highlight your target information. So Nygren's works, you know, if you know what the user's looking for, you can, and you highlight it, it improves scanning by as much as 83%. And it doesn't matter how you highlight it. All that matters is that it's different. So color, font, size, anything works. It's just, is it different? You want to use headers. People are very good at skipping, scanning first by headers and scanning from within. So if you've got a lot of information, a lot of menu items, use headers so that people don't have to read every single item. They can reduce the number of items that they have to look for. You want to use tightly packed vertical lists rather than horizontal lists when you can. Some eye movement study by Hornoff and Halverson found that if I've got it horizontally, I've got each item requires a separate fixation. But if I have them tight, a fixation picks up multiple items. So I have a lot fewer eye movements to get through the list when they're vertically and stacked, so that I can grab visually 3 or 4 items per fixation. Whereas in a horizontal layout, I almost always have to have a fixation per item. You want to avoid modality switches. So try to let everything be done either from the mouse or from the keyboard. Because if I'm on the keyboard, it takes 1.7 seconds to get to the mouse to move it and click on it, but it only takes 0.2 seconds to just click another keystroke if I'm already on the keyboard. So going back and forth between the keyboard and mouse is something that slows you down. And finally, you want to allow some flexibility. So instead of using a wizard, which is really good for the first-time user, you want to use forms, because forms let you jump around. Especially in contexts like a call center where you need to respond to requests that come in over the phone and act in terms of what you hear, or if you're using an electronic health record and the patient's telling you a history, not in particular order of your of your wizard, but and how they remember it. You want some flexibility in how you can enter that text. You want the forms to have a minimal amount of required fields. Required fields are very good of preventing database crashes, but you're better off to getting incomplete data as long as you can retrieve it than getting no data. And again, expert users end up using forms in ways you don't really anticipate. And so sometimes they just are going through forms to answer questions that come up, and they're not really filling them out for real. And if they're really hampered that I can't get past the screen without filling in every required field, then the use of those forms is limited. So again, there's certainly a place where you need to make sure that fields that are needed to store it properly are there. But beyond that, you want to, again, for your users that are using this form a lot, to have as few restrictions as possible. And finally, modal pop-ups are nice because they prevent you from doing anything else. But if you pop up a complex form and you need more information to fill out that form, now the fact that it's in a modal pop-up prevents you from oftentimes getting to the information you need to fill it out. So in a lot of situations, using a non-modal pop-up or a panel that still allows you full access to the underlying system is more useful. For a confirmation message, a modal pop-up is great because you don't want anything happen until they say, yes, do that or don't do that. But beyond a sort of decision, modal pop-ups are very limiting if you're using it for data entry of any amount. So those are some just some suggestions we have found of how to improve the efficiency, but there's still some considerations of if I'm using an interface a lot, how to design it so that I'm promoting actually developing a skill or competence. So I just want to touch on a couple things. One is to return to automaticity, because automaticity is a kind of a double-edged sword, and then talk a little bit about developing competence. So again, automaticity, the conditions for it are, constancy. Things have to stay the same in order for you to automate them. And then you've got to have a lot of repetition. So this is, when I see a same menu, for instance, this is this process that instead of scanning, I can use memory to recall where things are at. And then with more repetition, that actually just becomes an automatic process. So we typically think of automation in terms of motor actions, and those indeed are the first things to get automated. But decisions also get automated. And so if you look at a decision for, say, the first time that you've encountered a problem, what people do is they consider all the possible causes and then pick a response for solving that. And some are a little more impulsive than others, but there's still a what are the causes versus what do I do in response. But after you've encountered something over and over again, you shift to a rule-based situation. So if the person's got a red rash that covers the body, it's measles. If they got swollen cheeks, it's the mumps. And this is a little more prone to error. It might be poison ivy instead of measles, depending on how good your rules are and stuff. But even then, as you start doing that even more, then what an automated decision is, you're not even thinking. You see the cue and you respond. I hear the high RPM and I automatically shift. I don't think about it like I did when I first learning to use a shift on my car. If it's part of my process to fill out this form over and over again without thinking, I just fill in the name and the address, and there's no decisions being made at all. So again, the trade-off is, automation is really good, especially in multitasking situations. So if I'm using electronic health record and I'm trying to talk to my patient, or I'm on a call center trying to talk to the customer, I want to pay attention to the conversation. And then when I say, okay, well, you need such and such a drug, well, I want that to be automated. I want to spend as little time as possible filling out the form, and I want to be able to listen to the conversation as I fill out that form. So that, to the extent that things are automated, that dual processing is a lot easier if you don't have to use a lot of your resources to do one of the tasks. But again, some of the downsides of it is that it's inflexible and it's insensitive to exceptions. So what you want to do to manage automaticity is, in an interface, if you've got someone who's always doing the same thing over and over again, one of the things you can do is to truly automate it. And machines are much better than people at doing the same thing over and over again. So if you dial up 411 and you hear a person say, "What city and state, please?" For years now, that is not a person talking. The 411 operator comes in, they record what their voice is going to sound like today, and that is a recording when you first connect, and then they transfer you to the operator to finish the call. And just cutting out that 1 or 2 seconds of asking that question saves a company like Ameritech $5 million a year, because they get 1 billion calls a year, and every second they save saves money, but also it makes the job less boring for the person, because they come in at the more interesting part of the call and not doing the repetition. And the same if you're using software where you have to log what I did, and that is something that your system can log for you. Let the systems log it for you, and don't force a user to do something that a machine can do automatically. Prevent automaticity if the decisions are really critical. So stick in a step that you can't do automatically if you truly want someone to think about what they're doing. Or to turn it around, if you want to be in some sense diabolical, to make things difficult, if you're creating a game, let at an early level have a response be so repeated that it becomes automatic, and then at the next level have that automatic response be a wrong response, and you'll find that it's very difficult to change that automatic response. But anyway, you should be aware of automaticity and manage it and plan for it. Competence. The interesting thing about competence is that people acquire skill through success and not through failure. Even though we can learn lessons in life from failure, you don't develop skill from failing. So if you're trying to acquire a skill, the ideal situation is to let a person always be successful, but increasingly make the task more and more difficult, and so that they're still within the range of their ability. So this is a well-known principle in education. J. McVicker-Hunt at the U of I talked about this in terms of the problem of the match, of matching the ability of a learner to the difficulty of the task. If it's too easy, it gets boring. If it's too hard, the learner gets discouraged and walks away. So this is something that the gaming industry has really understood very well. So if you take a typical game, so this is one from an iPad. This is Om-Nom. Om-Nom loves candy, and the candy is away from him, so you can move your finger across the rope, and the ropes are configured differently, and he wants the candy. And indeed, if you cut the ropes in the right way, he'll be able to grab the candy and be a happy nom. And once you learn that and figure out how to use ropes, then what the program does is it introduces bubbles. And bubbles go up, and sometimes they go close enough, and sometimes they don't. But once you master bubbles, then you come to automatic ropes, which appear if you go into the circle, and then you encounter spikes that if the candy falls on it, it breaks. And then after you've mastered spikes, you move on to air cushions, you move on to spiders, and spiders, of course, also love candy, and Om-Nom doesn't get it when the spiders do get it. You know, and it's actually, you know, some of the underlying skills that it's developing is in some cases making timing an aspect of it. But the important principle is that they take a beginning skill and they build upon it, and they layer by layer introduce more and more complexity and difficulty. But it's engaging because you're always successful. And you can stay at the level long enough that you master it before you move on to the next one. Now, so controlling that difficulty to match competence is building skills. You can't always do that in the industry world, but there's certainly ways to do it, at least in part. So the notion of escalation, of having entry-level people answer phone calls, and then when they're too difficult, they can escalate up, is a nice way to sort of layer the difficulty of the call without, you know, end up in something that they're in over the head with a failure. Or you can do login roles that different job assignments have different difficulties assigned to them, different tasks that are routed to them, and manage complexity in that way. But aligning the task difficulty and with competence, it affects not only the skill but also motivation and satisfaction. So if you look at why do people keep using an interface, things that have intrinsic motivation, people use the interface because it's enjoyable. In industry, we have a lot of extrinsic motivation. Well, you use the interface because that's how I do my job. But they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So Decky's looked at in industry how you promote intrinsic motivation, and again, it has to do with I'm competent at my job and I've got autonomy to do it. And so it's if you can structure the complexity to match the competence, you improve the motivation, but you also improve satisfaction. So if I have an interface where I'm successful with very little of my skill, that quickly becomes boring. You know, if I'm using all the skill I have but I fail, that's discouraging. You know, if I fail but I'm not really trying, well, I'm not really trying. But the sort of golden quadrant is I'm using almost all my skill and I'm successful, and that's where you know, feel a sense of empowerment and accomplishment. So, in summary, heavily used interfaces, they need to be efficient. So we've talked about some principles of making information visible that you need for decision, using dense screens, keeping controls close to the content that you're acting on, relying on knowledge in the head, design for scanning, avoid modality switches, allowing flexibility. Heavily used interfaces need to be enjoyable, so you want to try to match difficulty to competence. And if you have an efficient and satisfying interface, then it will be heavily used because they'll enjoy it. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple questions. First question is, how do you know if you're making an interface fast?
So the question is, how do you know if, when you redesign an interface, for instance, that you're making it faster? And it's an interesting question because you can't use usability testing to assess that, because the efficiency of an interface only appears after you've mastered it. So one of the ways that we use is through cognitive modeling. So you have a task, and you write out the steps of the task that you need to perform it, moving the mouse and clicking it, and then you use like a GOMS model, which was developed in the 80s, that has values for how long it takes to make a decision to move the mouse, and you compare that model predicted time to the model predicted time of your old interface. And in both cases, the model's predicting, ideally, with no mistakes, what's the fastest that this interface will support. And by looking at the best possible predictions, you can tell if your design is moving in the right direction.
Another question is, how do you design an interface if someone uses it a lot, but others only use it occasionally?
So it's always a difficult problem in interface design of if you've got different types of users. So this is a dimension of they may be doing the same task, but someone in your company uses it a lot versus someone who seldom uses it. One approach is, it basically boils down to try to change the interface. Sometimes you can do this with the login role through a login role, introduce a different version that has more support. If there's not time to actually create two versions of it that you can control with the logins role or with the click for an advanced interface, then you can often bridge the gap just through additional training. So even though if I'm using it seldom, it's not a big deal to give a person a crib sheet of here are the steps to follow. And that's probably preferable to slow down the person who uses it occasionally than to slow down the person who uses it a lot by having to making the screens less dense, or to taking away some of the direct entry capabilities. So if you can't really choose, you don't have the luxury to make two different interfaces, then you want to bias it towards who's your most frequent user.
Another question, how do you redesign point-of-service interface? So if you need to add features or reskin the design, or there's a new workflow, how can you do it without affecting efficiency, minimizing errors, and frustrating users?
So the question is, so how do you add functionality or reskin the design without diminishing the efficiency? One is to have an understanding of what are the features that affect efficiency. So obviously changing colors and labeling have much less of an effect than the types of controls. In some cases, it's simply an empirical question. So again, if you've got time to do some modeling where you say, okay, I have a model where this task takes 12 seconds in best case to do, and afterwards it still takes 12 seconds, then you've got some reassurance that you're not making things worse. But a lot of the redesigns, if you don't affect the embedded base and it's simply truly an addition, then it's localized. But otherwise, it's an empirical question, and hopefully you've got a situation where you can test it before you actually launch with it.
What are some of the most common mistakes that you've seen or common pain points in expert interfaces?
Some of the most common is underestimating just how much people can learn, and usually it comes down to different trade-offs of, I don't want to rely on memory because that's going to introduce more errors, and but it's especially if on common tasks, if it may not introduce that many errors if you allow people to have direct entry, and there's certain types of errors that you can catch with error messages in the cases where you do it. So it's the biggest mistake that I've seen is giving too much weight to other dimensions, to other factors, either security or accuracy. Part of the thing about an expert interface is you are in fact putting more trust into your user, and a lot of the efficiency you get comes from the skill that the user develops over time. And if you don't, if you constrain that too much, you won't benefit from it. And there certainly are risks. There are certainly mission-critical safety, health issues that you don't want to weigh in terms of efficiency. But there's a lot of things where the trade-off is not that critical. So it's in part just understanding the importance of the trade-offs.
How important are the notions of delight in a heavily used interface, other than games, of course?
I think we underestimate the affect dimension of using interfaces. If I'm spending 8 hours a day in an interface that is irritating, my morale goes down and my productivity goes down. If I spend all day on something that is that allows me to perform better, and I do better work because of it, then my motivation and my productivity go up. So it's there's a number of research in terms of just the aesthetics of an attractive looking interface is often perceived to be more usable. And there's similar types of spillover effects of an interface that is satisfying to use is likewise going to be a more positive experience. Frankly, we've not done as much research in this area, so it's hard to point to a lot of data. But I think that we tend to underestimate the effects of morale and the effects that an enjoyable interface can have